Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Today we've hit a special milestone. Folks, we've traveled a lot of the USA, but today we're exploring my own home state, which means we're having this weird video run a little longer than usual, and I might even have a few more of these weird videos in me for the state where my heart resides. Now, before we get started, I want to remind y'all that I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and it would help me out a ton if you liked this video, subscribed, and commented your favorite weird urban legend. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, let's get into the video. Now, it's not often I include something that is debatably a haunted place on the weird folklore lists. I usually reserve these stories for haunted places videos, but the story of Tennessee's so-called Bell Witch is not just the most pervasive legend in all of Middle Tennessee in some people's opinions, where I grew up, but has also been regarded by some as America's greatest ghost story, and personally, I hold the story in extremely high regard. The story begins in the early 1800s when a settler named John Bell moved from North Carolina to Tennessee, settling in the Red River community, an area that is today Adams, Tennessee. Here, John and his family dwelled in a home on some property they owned, largely farming on a few hundred acres of land while participating in the community of their local Red River Baptist Church. John and his wife Lucy here had 3 more children, and largely a good, if uneventful, life here in Red River, though this all began to change in 1817. On this day, John was out in his cornfields, and he saw something strange. In the cornfield, he saw an animal that didn't look like anything he'd ever seen. It sort of looked like a dog with a rabbit's head, and upon shooting at it, the dog-rabbit thing disappeared into the corn rows. Of course, when you live in Tennessee during some parts of the year, seeing a weird and unexplainable creature is just your average Tuesday, so John didn't think much of it immediately. That is until later that evening when John and his whole family heard some sort of knocking noise on the walls of their home. They inspected, of course, and couldn't identify any culprit, but in the following nights, these sounds continued, and each time, family members would dart outside to find the source, and they'd be met with nothing but emptiness and the silence of the night. This knocking on the home's walls transitioned to sounds in their bedrooms. Some of the children even thought rats were gnawing on their bedposts, and after a while their covers would be pulled off from their beds, and the pillows underneath them were yanked out from under their heads while they slept. Now keep in mind, this is where most ghost stories end. Some dude moves into a house in Gary, Indiana or something, and some of their crap flies around the room, and they say, dang nabbit, this place is haunted, and they move on and it never progresses. This was not the case in the Bell Witch haunting. See, the haunting went far beyond what at this point was just poltergeist activity. Soon the family started to hear whispering, which they likened to a woman singing hymns, an old one at that. Next, Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter of the family, began to report that she would be slapped and have her hair pulled by some unseen force, and the rest of the family would actually report seeing markings on her body related to these ghostly attacks. Now, the family would try their best to keep these occurrences secret, but eventually they would share these encounters with their neighbor, James Johnston, who would actually come over and spend the night with his wife in their home. Of course, at first, nothing really happened, but after they went to bed, the Johnston family was also confronted with these same terrors. James was slapped and his covers were yanked from him. He apparently, according to history, remarked the sort of funny but also famous quote, "In the name of the Lord, who are you and what do you want?" Though of course his pleas were met with silence. And if you buy the stories, after uttering the Lord's name, the remainder of his stay was uneventful. He, of course, in the morning would tell the family of his experience, and he was convinced whatever had attacked him was some sort of evil spirit, I quote, "the kind that the Bible talks about." Additionally, the Bell family was, well, not that virtuous. They kept enslaved people on their property, and these enslaved individuals also had encounters with the so-called Bell Witch. One in particular, named Dean, reported multiple encounters with the Bell Witch, even being one of the only others, in addition to John Bell, to see the dog-like creature that John reported, and in his case, claiming that it often presented itself as a two-headed dog sort of creature, leading him to start carrying around objects to protect himself from the beast, such as something he referred to as a witch ball. Now, if you're familiar with ghost and demonic lore, you'll understand, well, that it's commonly reported the more fear you offer these preternatural beings, the more likely they'll be to abuse their power, and as such, perhaps it's only fitting that this entity continued to get stronger. The voices, which were for whispered hymns, became loud. It would sing hymns at full volume, and it would quote scriptures loudly. It would also hold conversations with family members, and it apparently even verbatim once quoted a sermon that was occurring live at a church 13 miles away. Additionally, these encounters became less of a secret, and accounts spread like wildfire, and even Major General Andrew Jackson in Nashville would hear of the recently named Bell Witch. And funny enough, given John Bell and his brother fought alongside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson and a party of men would actually visit the property in 1819. Now, this visit, if you buy the accounts, did not go smoothly. It started with the wagon they were traveling in becoming stuck in a creek bed on the property, which they apparently quickly realized must have been the doing of the Bell Witch, and upon exclaiming the name of this witch, a female voice apparently told them that they could go onto the property, but they'd be met by her later that evening. Now, among this group that traveled with Jackson, one was a so-called witch tamer, which, if you know your history, likely paints this man in a poor light. But in this case, he apparently claimed to have a pistol with silver bullets that could banish spirits. And he said this would scare off the Bell Witch. Of course, poetically, this man, upon exclaiming this, would immediately begin to scream, reporting the sensation of being stuck with pins and needles and beaten. And the woman's voice would reappear, calling the man a fraud. At this point, the men wanted to leave, but Jackson would insist they stay, having him and his men retire to bed. Admittedly, there's no clear history on what happened to Jackson that night, but his crew would leave to return to Nashville the next morning, saying, "I would rather fight the British at New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch." Ultimately, after 3 years of the witch's attacks on John Bell, the assaults would take their toll. Over the course of this episode, John Bell would start experiencing twitching in his face and difficulty swallowing, and by the late 1820s, he would be bedridden and experience seizures, while still being tormented by the Bell Witch. John would ultimately pass away in December of 1820. Now, John's passing wouldn't be the end of this whole saga. After his passing, the family would find a vial of weird liquid on the property, which turned out to be poison, which the Bell Witch apparently claimed she used to end the life of John. And even at John's funeral, it's said that the Bell Witch laughed and sang the whole way through, with the whole procession actually hearing its cries. Now, only after John was well and buried did the Bell Witch finally shut up, largely ceasing its harassment of the family. Though I should note, at this point its effects were not totally forgotten. For instance, Betsy became engaged to another local named Joshua Gardner, a man who lived nearby, and when they would spend time together outside of the home, particularly near the Red River of the nearby fields, or even the nearby cave, the Bell Witch would haunt them, nagging them. And this constant harassment and urging by the spirit to break off their love affair would lead Betsy to break off their engagement. Additionally, after this engagement was broken off, Lucy Bell, John Bell's widow, would be told by the creature that it would return in 7 years, and as promised, it did return in 1828 to haunt John Bell Jr. This later haunting is sort of strange. In this reappearance, it acted less like some sort of monster and rather imbued some sort of seer-like quality upon John, discussing with him the origin of life and the need for a spiritual awakening in America, among other things. It also apparently predicted the Civil War, which, given tensions between the North and South were already rising, would not have been that difficult to do. Regardless, after this, the Bell Witch would claim that it would visit John Bell's most direct descendant in 107 years. And while in 1935, Dr. Charles Bailey Bell would publish a book about the Bell Witch recounting these stories, it doesn't appear he ever personally confronted the witch. That being said, in the book he wrote, he would recount previously unheard stories about the Bell Witch, including the tales of how it first appeared to John Bell, and one of a boy who became trapped in the so-called Bell Witch Cave who was actually pulled out of the cave by his feet by the witch, Also, while we're discussing the Bell Witch Cave, I should note that while this cave didn't really play any significant role in the initial encounters with the Bell Witch, this cave has become notorious in its own right, with some positing that the witch may have retreated into this cave after the initial rash of encounters in the 1800s. This speculation began in 1937 when farmer Louis Garrison reported hearing strange noises coming from the cave, and that same year, some local individuals even saw an apparition sitting on a cliff over the cave. Also in the 1940s, one Bonnie Hainline reported that she and her friends would explore the cave, and while inside, her lantern she was using for light would blow out multiple times, despite the lack of any apparent breeze. Heck, perhaps even more famously, in the 1980s there were a few encounters, including one where a writer for the Tennessean, a prominent Nashville newspaper if you're not familiar, would try to sleep in this cave with his team overnight, only to experience strange noises which culminated in screams coming from inside of the cave, which drove them away. Strangely enough, in the same year of this Tennessean journalist encounter, an owner of a gas station ironically ran out of gas near the cave, and recounted that as he walked towards town for gas, a rabbit began to hop after him. He ran, and the rabbit started chasing after him, and as the gas station owner sat on a log to catch his breath from running from a rabbit, the rabbit would apparently hop up on the other side of the log, look him in the eyes, and say, "Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it?" Anyways, that's basically the role the cave plays, that it appears to be the source of the supposed ongoing haunting related to the Bell Witch. So this is the tale of the Bell Witch, America's possibly most famous haunting, or at least the most famous in the South. Today, the Bell Farm property still exists, of course, and here it's said that possible hauntings persist, though to a lesser extent than they used to. Today, it's said that you can still hear voices, and sometimes strange lights can be seen floating through the fields of the old Bell Farm at night. Additionally, strange apparitions in photos are also commonplace. Whatever you believe, if you want to humor these stories, the old Bell farmhouse still remains, and you can visit this property and the famed Bell Witch Cave if you wish. So we're going to be talking about the Wampus Cat, a cryptid that I not only heard of during my time at the University of Tennessee, but, well, weirdly enough, I have a fun story of my own regarding this cryptid. Prominent in eastern Tennessee, but honestly also prominent throughout the whole southern USA, is a story of a creature referred to as the Wampus Cat. Despite being referred to as the Wampus Cat, often this creature is portrayed as part cat, part dog. The Wampus Cat is usually nocturnal, which is why at night sometimes you might see glowing yellow eyes following you from the nearby foliage. And you might hear a shrill and loud cry coming from the woods, accompanying those eyes. The beast also sort of smells foul, sort of like stinky skin, it's said, and it's even known to occasionally stand on two legs while hunting in some early accounts. Regarding sightings of this creature, perhaps the earliest in Tennessee is recounted by a man named S.E. Schlosser, who actually told the tale of another local. This man was apparently out hunting with his dog when it ran off, and suddenly this man smelled something terrible, only to see a gigantic feline staring daggers at him while approaching him on two legs. Luckily, he was near his friend's home, who let him in, and the creature attacked the door for a bit until the man read passages from the book of Psalms from the Bible, which ultimately drove this creature away. Additionally, weirdly enough, in the early 2000s, there was a sighting of the Wampus Cat in Knoxville itself, when a student at my alma mater, the University of Tennessee, who was living at 16th and Cumberland in an apartment, saw the creature during the first week of classes. This night, she was supposedly looking out of her window and saw a gigantic man-sized cat walking on its hind legs through town with glowing eyes. She watched this beast until it walked out of sight. By the way, local insight here, at least when I lived in Knoxville, there was no apartment complex right at this intersection. But I'm going to assume she saw this creature here from her window in Volunteer Hall, which when I was there was the nice dorm on campus. It was built in 2004, so this is possible. She also might have lived in Hinson Hall, which is just offset from this intersection. Regardless, since this account in the early 2000s, students at the University of Tennessee have reported time and time again to see this exact same creature, and report that it's particularly common on UT's Hill, a portion of campus that is on a very big hill, sort of self-explanatory, I guess. And this is actually where my story about the Wampus Cat comes in. Also, I kid you not, this is not hyperbole, I'm skeptical as heck, but I saw something weird this night. So my story starts on a cool fall night in October of 2015. Tennessee had just barely beaten Georgia in football at a score of 38-31, and I was walking from my friend's apartment building at 12th and Laurel Avenue in Fort Sanders, which is basically a student ghetto north of campus, across the bridge connecting 12th Street to the hill. I went up the hill a bit, and in my celebratory state, I'll say, I thought I'd slip down to Estabrook Road so I could walk by Neeland and breathe in the sweet scent of victory once more. Now, if you know this part of campus, you'll know this part of campus, back in the day, used to get really, really quiet. And really, really dark at night. So quiet that you could sometimes hear the nearby Second Creek running from the back of the hill. Now, this is where I was as I started to approach good old Neeland, and then I heard crunching to my left, sort of down where Estabrook Hall and Pasqua Nuclear Engineering used to be, two halls that are now demolished. And between these two buildings, near an old quiet fountain with benches, I saw something absolutely gigantic. At first, I kid you not, I interpreted this as Smokey, like the mascot for the University of Tennessee, leaned down on his hands and knees and dunking the mascot's head in the fountain. Remember, I had my share of celebration at this point this night, but quickly I shook it off and realized that was not Smokey. That was an animal, a large animal, and it was drinking out of the fountain. Next, my brain interpreted it as a black bear, but the thing is, it also kind of had a long tail. At least that's what I saw. Now, I didn't inspect further. I was toasted at this point, I was tired, and I decided I didn't want to get mauled in addition to the post-celebratory headache I was going to have the following day, so I got out of Dodge and never looked back. Regardless, that is my one and only cryptid story, probably the only one I've got in my arsenal that's not one of my grandparents. So it's said that this creature roams Appalachia, and sometimes even the campus of the University of Tennessee. Now, if you want to hear the Cherokee origin story for the Wampus Cat, yes, it's a creature that is spoken of in Cherokee lore. Stick around for a second, otherwise skip to the next timestamp in the description for the next weird tale regarding Tennessee. Still there? Okay. In Cherokee lore, the Wampus Cat is known as Iwa, and it's often a symbolic representation of a woman who didn't trust her husband. In the story, to put it simply, a woman put on a mountain lion's coat and actually went to go spy on her husband as he went out hunting with another warrior. Frankly, this seems like a good way to get hunted yourself, but regardless, she eventually made too much noise in the bushes and was caught spying by her husband, who was absolutely furious that he was not trusted and was spied on. As such, she was punished to wear this skin forever, turning her into the Wampus Cat. I have to be honest, this story doesn't really age well, but hey, that's the story. Anyways, if you have a weird story of your own about some sort of feline in the Appalachian region, or in the Smokies, or even on the University of Tennessee's campus yourself, I would love to hear it in the comments. When most think of Nashville, they think of bachelorette parties, honky-tonks, hot chicken, and country music. But lo and behold, at one point, the area that currently comprises downtown Nashville was once settled by a dirty group of Frenchmen beginning in the 1710. I'm joking, I promise. Anyways, these were fur traders under the lead of Jean de Charleville, or Charles Charleville, who referred to the location as French Lick, settling at a natural sulfur and saline spring near the area that is today Bicentennial Capitol Mall State Park. So how on earth, of all of the possible names Nashville could have had, did Nashville get the name French Lick? Well, funny enough, it's because of the animals in the area. This area, as I stated, was a natural sulfur spring and saline spring, and therefore it had rich salt deposits which attracted deer galore to supplement their diets. These deer would wander to this area from all around to literally lick rocks, and knowing this, Native American hunters came to the area to hunt these animals as they were licking rocks, and trade their furs with the French. Thus, they named the area after its initial economic advantage. For similar reasons, modern-day Nashville would also hold the name Sulphur Spring Bottom and Sulphur Dell at other points in history. Today, while there's really no remnants, from what I can tell, of this spring that gave Nashville its original name, at these coordinates, next to the Bicentennial Mall Capitol Park, right next to the Sound Stadium if you're familiar with the area, there's a historical marker recounting the story. A funny bit of trivia too if you're a Nashville native, when the French fur traders were in the region, they were basically the only white folks in the whole area. That is, except for a group of individuals named for the really long hunting trips they took throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Long Hunters, the individuals for which Nashville's nearby Long Hunter State Park was named. So in Summerstown, Tennessee, a town far south of Nashville, sort of between Lawrenceburg and Columbia, there's a so-called haunted house attraction that in actuality might be better described as the workings of a sociopath. This attraction, called McKamey Manor, was opened by Navy vet Russ McKamey in 2017, and its claim to fame is that it offered a prize of $20,000 to anyone who could complete the full tour of the home, which, I should be absolutely clear, is definitively not a manor. It's like a humble little home in rural Tennessee. I should also note that you are allowed to fail so-called challenges during this haunted house attraction, but if you do fail one or use profanity, funny enough, $500 is deducted from the prize pot. Regardless, folks heard the offer of $20,000 and thought, I can do that, and it garnered a 27,000 person waiting list relatively quickly. The tour that was offered, though, you see, was no normal haunted house attraction. A taste of what you'd get would start with a 40-page waiver that you'd have to sign to even enter the home. This waiver essentially said, 1, you have to be 21 to enter, 2, you need to get a sports physical or doctor's note that confirms your mental and physical health, 3, you need proof of medical insurance, 4, there are phone call screenings, and 5, there are no safe words, no quitting unless the man running it, Russ, says you can quit. And essentially, there are no limits to what he can do to you. Additionally, at least in more modern iterations of this haunted house, a 2-hour video was played for guests showing what previous visitors had to go through, which I'm sure was pretty disturbing. Also, when the waiver said there were no limits to what the tour would put them through, it truly meant no limits. I can't describe everything, but literally it can be likened to a torture chamber. For instance, a few examples that are YouTube friendly: you might be waterboarded, you might be put inside of a very small and tight box, tarantulas might be dropped on you, you might have a tooth extracted. Yes, I said that right. Dental work may be performed on you. Frankly, these things I'm describing are among the more tame and civil things they might do to you too. I'm not exaggerating. If you can't tell, this place is, or was, sort of insane, and you would also likely fall into this category if you chose to add yourself to the list of presumably nuts individuals who for some reason would want to enter this house, even for $20,000. That being said, if you are accepted into the home from this list of what I can only imagine are masochists, what exactly is your price of entry? What does the host get out of these guests that he's inviting into his home? Well, funny enough, all he asks for in return for you to enter his torture chamber are 4 cans of dog food or a single bag of it. In recent years, it sounds like they also accept optional monetary donations. Anyways, at this point, you may be thinking, how in the world is this so-called attraction legal? And after an episode of Monster Inside aired in October of 2023, the Tennessee Attorney General, Jonathan Scrimetti, was wondering the same thing, and the property owner was actually arrested on some pretty heinous charges in July of 2024. Though I'll admit, these charges were dropped just a few months later. Now, I must admit, to me it seems like through all of the media I'm reading, this so-called attraction remains open, but I can't be positive if it is following the arrest of the owner last year, and due to the fact that Google Maps lists the business as permanently closed. Regardless, this gruesome so-called haunted house attraction is by far the most gruesome thing I've read about existing that is like a business that you can attend in the USA. It's definitely a strange, if not unwelcome bit of lore for Tennessee, and frankly, if you've been there, you should get yourself checked out. But hey, if you have been there and you're watching this video, my goodness gracious, tell me what it's like in the comments if you're still able to type. It sounds like you might have removed your finger, but hey, just let me know. Was it crazy? Was it weird? Are you this guy's neighbor? I really want to know. What's it like to go in there? So this is a short one, but if you're planning on visiting Nashville, maybe this will offer you a fun Easter egg on your next pub crawl. In downtown Nashville, there's a Chicago-style bar located in Midtown named the Red Door Saloon. Historically speaking, the bar isn't anything super significant, as it was opened in 2002, though it has seen its share of successful musicians pass through and play. That being said, there's a fun little throwback inside of this bar. See, back in the day, at the first location of the Red Door Saloon, a shoe cobbler operated before the bar moved in, and in this shoe cobbler's establishment, there was a hole in the floor. Into this hole, many leather shavings dropped over time, and in the eyes of the people that started the Red Door Saloon, this hole and the leather inside of it were symbolic. They portrayed the history of the place or the skeletons in the proverbial closets of the location. Because of this, both of the Red Door Saloon locations in Nashville have peepholes in them, from which you can peer through to look into the establishment's basement, through which you'll see skeletons inside. Get it? You can see these skeletons in their closet, so to speak. Okay, I find this amusing because I'm a weirdo, but hopefully you like it too. Now, it's not often I give a tip about my personal life to the channel, but if you were to see me here in the winter, you'd be able to identify me from the hat that I wear on my head. It's yellow and blue, and it has a saber-toothed tiger on it. This emblem on the hat, of course, is the trademark logo of the Nashville Predators, Nashville's hockey team. The Preds were founded in 1997, following Craig Leopold's request that the NHL expand to more cities. And following this, NHL franchises were offered conditionally to Nashville, Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. This occurred, funny enough, following rumors that the Jersey Devils may relocate to Nashville in 1995, but I digress. Regardless, the Predators could have had any name. They could have been the Nashville Honky Tonks, maybe the Nashville Wildmen. Heck, they could have been the Wampus Cats. Okay, maybe these names would have been lame, but anyways, they decided to name themselves instead based on something else. See, in 1971, when the construction of the first American National Bank building was underway, the building which today is the UBS Tower in Nashville, when they broke ground, they found something fascinating: the partial skeleton of a creature known as the Smilodon, or a saber-toothed cat. Of course, after unveiling the logo of the saber-toothed cat, they did hold a vote, seeing if folks wanted the name Ice Tigers, Fury, or the Nashville Attack. 3 names that kind of sound ridiculous to me, to be honest, but Leopold would actually add his own submission to the pool too: the Nashville Predators. On November 13th of 1997, it would be announced that his submission won, and the name Nashville Predators would be the official name for the hockey franchise. If you go back to newspaper articles from around the 1960s in Memphis, Tennessee, you'll find interesting mentions of a place called Voodoo Village, which is described as an arrangement of strange artwork and symbols on a particular property in the south part of town. These articles are, interesting to say the least, and honestly, a little bit disturbing. Many of them fearmonger, describing how the owner of this so-called Voodoo Village practices dangerous techniques on those that come to him for healing. And in at least one case, these articles described a sting operation of sorts, where a police officer posing as a patient went to this individual seeking help, only to arrest the property owner and his wife for their practices, even though the police reported that the officer involved in the sting was only given a variety of grass and leaves, which they were instructed to boil into a tincture. Regardless, because of these damning articles and the strange design choices made on the property, this place held on to its unwelcome name, the Voodoo Village, ever since the 1960s, and into modern day. Because of this, local youth and even some adults venture down to take a look at and sometimes trespass upon this plot of land. And often folks speculate about these strange individuals that live here or the practices they've adopted. Like many things we cover here, though, the truth surrounding this so-called Voodoo Village's lore is distinctly different than locals would have you believe. In reality, the Voodoo Village was founded by one Wash Harris and his wife Sarah Harris. Wash was an African Native American healer from Mississippi who in 1957 decided to make some changes on his plot of land in South Memphis, and according to some Masonic and biblical passages, turned it into a shrine based on his interpretation of these groups' texts. He would name this shrine not the Voodoo Village, but rather the St. Paul Spiritual Holy Temple, where he would build everything from a workshop to underground shelters and monuments. And this place wasn't meant to harbor evil or conduct misdeeds. Rather, Wash genuinely wanted it to be a place where healing could take place for his clients and where worship could occur. Of course, in the 1960s, an era when segregation was still ripe, locals were not a fan of a plot of land owned by an African Native American individual that stood out, and this attracted scrutiny not just from the locals, but as we've discussed, also from the police. It is also what prompted rumors of everything from animal sacrifice to voodoo practices like voodoo dolls being used to target people outside of the property, rumors that were distinctly untrue. Ultimately, despite the harsh pushback from the community, Doc Harris, as he was called, was never dissuaded and continued his practices and teachings, as well as maintaining his distinctly unique, but to him, meaningful property. Now, Doc Harris would go on to pass away in 1995, but his grandson, Washington James Mook Harris, would adopt the title of Temple Leader, and to this day continues to keep the property in tip-top shape, while simultaneously offering his services to a select few individuals, as past experiences have perhaps rightfully made the family weary of offering their services to the general public. So in short, there is not some strange and perhaps dangerous voodoo village that practices the occult in southern Memphis. Not that voodoo is what Hollywood makes it out to be anyways, though that's a matter for another day. Rather, this place is the domain of a man who wanted to combine his African Native American heritage with the viewpoints of the Freemasons, tying it all together in a knot with Christian viewpoints from black spiritual churches of the southern USA. While his views were certainly unique, my impression is that Wash Harris's practices were not harmful to the community, and likely didn't warrant his poor treatment or the unwelcome notoriety he received. We can only hope that his grandson is treated better despite the unique operation he runs in southern Memphis. Memphis is known for many things, some of which we've covered on this list already, but one of these things is definitely more fun weird than weird weird if you catch my drift, and that is the fact that the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis has a fountain in its lobby where for 6 hours a day you can see ducks swimming around happily. So how does a hotel come to hold onto this tradition where not only do ducks swim in their lobby, but they also go on a grand march led by their so-called duck master, where they walk from their enclosure on the hotel's roof to the lobby in formation? Well, this story starts in 1930 when Frank Shute, the Peabody's general manager at the time, and his friend returned from a hunting trip. And as the legend goes, they were deep into the depths of wherever it is that old Jack Daniels sends you, and one of them had the bright idea to place live duck decoys inside of the fountain in the Peabody's lobby. Funny enough, the guests apparently had a hoot seeing the ducks in the lobby, and soon they'd acquired North American mallards to permanently swim in the fountain. Of course, this wasn't initially an orderly process, but that changed in 1940 when a hotel bellman, or the employee who would take your luggage to your room for you, revealed that in a previous life he'd been a circus animal trainer. With this skill set, this bellman, named Edward Pembroke, would train the ducks to walk in a line and would create the tradition of the famous Duck March, which he personally led until his retirement in the 90s. Nowadays, there's a new duck master, but despite this new duck master, the tradition of old remains, and 5 North American mallards swim in the hotel lobby fountain between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. daily. Don't worry though, if you're there during other hours of the day, you can go to the hotel's roof and watch the ducks lounging in their enclosures. Personally, I've been to the Peabody, and well, what can I say, I'm a big fan of ducks, so I love this local oddity and the lore behind it. 10 out of 10, I would recommend it. If you watched my Ohio video, you're already familiar with the theme of failed utopian societies. There we saw hubris take a heavy toll, flooding the town of Utopia, Ohio, and sweeping away many followers of the peculiar community that once lived there. Now we turn to Tennessee, near the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area, where another utopian experiment took shape. Now we'll see how they fared instead. The story of Rugby begins with Thomas Hughes, born in Uffington, Oxfordshire, England, in the early 1800s. As a young man, Thomas attended the Rugby School in Warwickshire, an institution that would later inspire the name of his own settlement, but England wasn't doing it for him. By his late 30s, Hughes had grown disillusioned with Victorian England, particularly with the rigid inheritance system that left younger sons with little opportunity and no inheritance. Perhaps driven by his frustration, he left England in 1870 and traveled to America, where he met his friend, poet James Russell Lowell. After arriving in the US, Hughes enlisted the help of a Boston-based group, the Board of Aid to Land Ownership, which specialized in relocating individuals to rural areas. It was members of this organization, traveling by train through Tennessee, who first identified what they saw as the perfect site for a new community, drawn to the untouched forests and natural beauty of the region. Now, upon returning to the Northeast, this group was looking for people to go to this region in Tennessee to settle it, but they found that many of the people up there, perhaps due to the economic stability of New England, were too comfortable to leave. Hughes, however, was undeterred and agreed to help establish this colony. Now, this area, largely staked out by Franklin W. Smith of the Board of Aid, saw its first structure built in the 1880s. Early settlers also constructed croquet and tennis courts and even an inn, officially opening the colony in October of 1880. At the inauguration for this colony, Hughes would deliver a speech outlining his vision, a community where everyone contributed to a town commissary and personal liberties were guaranteed, except when it came to alcohol, which was strictly banned. I'm sure that was a popular decision. The colony would also welcome individuals of all religious denominations, though there's reason to suspect this so-called religious freedom was only intended for Christians, but I'll leave that up for debate. Maybe I'm missing something here. Still, I appreciate the sentiment, though I'd be sneaking off to ferment some fruit in a barrel if I lived there, if you catch my drift. Regardless, for a while, the settlement thrived. By 1884, over 400 people called Rugby home, and the town boasted an impressive 65 public buildings along with plenty of extracurricular activities. In 1885, the colony even established Arnold School, named after the headmaster of Hughes' alma mater, Rugby School. But with every rise comes a fall. In 1881, a typhoid outbreak claimed 7 lives. Then in 1884, disaster struck when the Tabard Inn, a key piece of Rugby's tourism industry, burned to the ground. Economic failures soon followed, including an ill-fated attempt to launch a tomato canning business, despite the fact that the local soil was terrible for growing tomatoes. The venture was so poorly conceived that newspapers, as far as London in England, ridiculed Hughes. By 1887, many colonists had either died off or left, and Hughes himself abandoned the settlement for good, with most of the remaining inhabitants following suit. The final blow came in 1892 when Sir Henry Kimber reorganized the Board of Aid as the Rugby, Tennessee Company, not to resettle the area but to extract resources from it. In doing so, he marked the unofficial end of Rugby's utopian dream. So in short, Rugby, Tennessee was once a utopian sort of colony. They tried their best to make it a perfect settlement, but ultimately it didn't work out. Anyways, if you've been to the area that is modern-day Rugby, let me know in the comments. Does it feel very utopian to you? In Cleveland, Tennessee, a town of about 50,000 people northeast of Chattanooga, there's a curious folklore figure, a sort of scary-looking woman who stands at a towering 7 feet and 6 inches in height. A character who today is the county's official Halloween mascot, but who in the past was a very scary and very, very real individual in town. If you're a native of Tennessee, you may have interacted with individuals who lived here a few generations ago, and through them, you might have actually heard stories of Tall Betsy. Apparently, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, if you were walking the streets of Cleveland, Tennessee at night, you were liable to run into this extremely tall woman out on a walk. By all accounts, this woman wasn't some cryptid. Rather, she was a real person that was really, really tall. But regardless, sightings of this giant prompted wives' tales to be spun by parents who didn't want their children out too late, claiming that if they didn't come home before dark, Tall Betsy would be out looking for them. Of course, speculation at the time was that this tall woman may not have actually been real, and that in reality, Tall Betsy was just a police officer dressed up to scare local youth, but at this point, we'll never really know what the truth is. Regardless, to this day, because of these tales and the events they inspired, Tall Betsy is watched for by the local children, and these tales have even inspired a poem to be written about her. Now, for copyright reasons, I should avoid reading this poem, but to summarize it, it tells the tale of the legend of Tall Betsy, spinning her tale saying she comes out on Halloween, walking down Centenary Avenue while dressed in black. Before 10 p.m., this poem says she won't cause any harm to the children that are out late, but if they stay out beyond this time, you'll be taken to Fort Hill Cemetery into her mausoleum, where you may in fact be eaten. Honestly, I love a good poem to scare the local kids into submission, so this is great fun for me. Now, no story about Tall Betsy would be complete without discussing Alan Jones, a local businessman who's actually the owner of check-into-cash payday loans and is also the namesake behind the University of Tennessee Aquatic Center. Alan Jones, it's said, was told tales of Tall Betsy by his grandmother growing up, And when the city of Cleveland was exploring options to revitalize its downtown, including picking out an official spook for the city to feature on Halloween, Jones knew it was his time to act. He told the committee that he, himself, would dress up as Tall Betsy and play the part of this local folkloric figure on Halloween. They said yes to this request, so he did it one year, and then the next year he did it again. And by the third year, Tall Betsy had become so famous, Alan Jones' neighbors were getting mad at him. Heck, by some accounts I'm reading, by 1998, over 11,000 faces came to see Tall Betsy at Alan Jones's house. Ultimately, this whole legend would make Centenary Avenue a sort of local Halloween epicenter, and thousands of people would flock there every year to trick-or-treat and to see Tall Betsy. It's actually really cool. Homes on Centenary Avenue play different roles, too. There's obviously the Tall Betsy home, but aside from that, there's a home that dresses up as a graveyard, and another one with a pumpkin patch. It's a really cool practice if you ask me. Now, the main allure of this whole getup, of course, is when Tall Betsy herself comes out of the Alan Jones home and would make her way down Centenary Avenue. Now, as Jones aged, it became more and more taxing to play the part of Tall Betsy every year, and after 1998, he gave up the shtick, letting Tall Betsy's costume retire. That being said, he wouldn't be forgotten. This whole legend and the hubbub caused by Jones' incredible costume would ultimately result in the Halloween block party in Cleveland, Tennessee that is popular to this day. That being said, I read that something interesting happened in 2014. As far as I can tell, while Alan Jones doesn't dress up in stilts and robes to play the part of Tall Betsy anymore, his son Bailey Jones does. Bailey now, every Halloween, throws on his costume and stilts, and upon sunset, will roam down Centenary Avenue in Cleveland, Tennessee, scaring kids and allowing the legend of Tall Betsy to prosper for years to come. The mountains of Tennessee are known for their legends of mysterious creatures said to inhabit the dense woods, from crawlers to the aptly named not deer, and even Sasquatch himself. These well-visited forests are shrouded in their share of secrets. Among the most intriguing, though, is the tale of the so-called wild men. As the story goes, these cryptic figures are said to be descendants of people who abandoned society over a century ago, choosing instead to live as animals in the wilderness, isolated for generations. They're rumored to speak their own language, lead secluded lives in the woods and caves of the Smokies, and sometimes they're even blamed for disappearances, particularly those of children, and there are claims that they practice cannibalism. Now, if true, this would be a chilling prospect. Feral human beings disconnected from society, preying on those who wander too far into the forest. But is there any evidence to support this eerie tale? Strangely, the answer is sort of. To start, in 1896, there was an encounter that's now broadly known as the Wild Man of Chihuahua. In this episode, 4 hunters came across what they interpreted as a man roaming the forest in the nude. This man, however, had distinctly non-man-like qualities, such as talon-like fingers and toenails, and also tusks coming from the side of his head. His hair also reached down as far as his waist. Despite this, the hunters tried to capture the man to bring him to Cleveland, Tennessee, but this creature easily escaped them, exiting back into the forest from when he came. There was also an 1889 New York Times article recounting the story of the Wild Man of Tennessee. According to reports near Chattanooga, sightings described a giant figure covered in thick hair that was untamable and violent. Locals speculated he might even be the twin brother of one of Barnum's wild men. The article described him as hurling rocks at anyone who approached and remaining entirely beyond the reach of civilization. Finally, in more modern day, there are also a handful of encounters with these so-called wild men. One of these is by paranormal investigator Rob Phillips, which some take to impact this story's credibility, but regardless, Phillips was in the woods near Watauga Cliffs in the Smoky Mountain chain, sort of east of Johnsonville, Tennessee, and suddenly on this rainy evening the forest became silent. FYI, if you hear the forest go silent, that usually means something big or otherwise threatening to wildlife is in the area. Soon they heard a twig snap, next a scream, and soon after this, Phillips observed a large figure close to him behind a tree. It was apparently 9 feet tall, had red glowing eyes, and was covered in dark fur. Also, the thing stunk to high heavens. Finally, a small personal account here, as someone who's lived in eastern Tennessee for a while and ventured into the Smokies on a weekly basis. The family of a woman I knew in Merville, Tennessee, used to speculate around their living room at night over whether some of the yells they heard on the opposite side of the ridge on their property could possibly be due to some wild people. I kid you not. I'm not saying they did indeed hear wild men like the ones in these stories, but I'm emphasizing that these stories of feral people are pervasive locally. Reddit, too, and even some fringe publications like those from David Paulides, Missing 411 and such, also posit that the woods of the Smokies are home to these wild individuals, and parrot again the claim that it might be wild people that are resulting in the disappearances of so many children in the Smokies, including that of Dennis Martin, a famous case in the area. Heck, some even claim that the government knows about these wild people, but rather than cause a panic and harm the tourism industry around Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, they keep the discussion around wild people quiet. With all of this in mind, the prospect of wild people is certainly interesting. Indeed, there have been plenty of people that have chosen to leave society behind in their past, living out their days as hermits of sorts. From Ralph Waldo Emerson to Christopher Knight to Alice Mabel Gray, we've covered these individuals here from time to time. And these sorts of folks are certainly the inspiration for these wild people. But at the same time, I find it interesting that so many of these stories attribute these sightings to feral people rather than Bigfoot-like entities because, believe it or not, when I spend too much time in the woods, I generally don't find myself getting any larger or taller, and I sadly don't imagine even a lifetime in the woods could get me into the 7-foot tall range, let alone the 9-foot tall range. Despite this, many of these historic and modern reports refer to the wild men of Tennessee as both feral people and Sasquatch-like creatures. So what do you think? Do you think in this day and age, where much, if not most, of the Smoky Mountains National Park and eastern Tennessee has cell service, that these creatures or even feral people can remain hidden? Additionally, considering the 1800s article from the New York Times, this article mentioned Barnum, aka P.T. Barnum, aka essentially the father of clickbait and the original high-profile scam artist. Do you think this old New York Times article or the other historical articles referencing the wild man are even legitimate? Personally, I'm skeptical, but trust me, I believe people are living in the Smoky Mountains off the grid and probably making some shine while they're at it, but I'm not sold on the idea that they have meaningfully different traits from modern people. But hey, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm well known to be wrong. Alright, now this last bit of lore is a tease storytime special. If there's a performer playing at the Ryman and you'd like to take your chances to try and meet them, I can't guarantee this'll work, but local lore says it's probably your best bet. And it sort of worked for me, I'll get to that. So to start, a bit of background, the Ryman Auditorium is, at least in my opinion, the place to watch live music or a performance in Nashville. It's historic, it's beautiful inside and out, and there's not a bad seat in the house. The spot's class, opulence, and allure, in my opinion, stand in stark contrast to the veritable smorgasbord of indulgence, debauchery, excess, and enough sin to make a preacher faint that linger just 200 feet away from its doorstep on Broadway. This place hosts everything from the most famous contemporary musicians, to comedians, to world-renowned public figures, and frankly, I can't recommend it enough. Anyways, standing between the Ryman and Broadway is an alley known as the Ryman Alley, a place that's sort of renowned as a hidey hole where celebrities can duck out of the music venue and grab a drink in the nearby Tootsies without catching the wandering eyes of the mob that lingers on the other side of these buildings. Here, in this alley, is likely your best bet to run into a celebrity. I'm not saying loiter there and harass people, but I am saying it's perfectly acceptable to take a stroll down the alley and see if anyone notable is passing by. Funny enough, in 2018, I did just that. I can remember the night as clear as a glass of Smoky Mountain shine. It was January 24th of 2018, a chilly night by Nashville standards, and I took my then girlfriend to see John Mulaney live and in person. I personally had a ball, John is a hoot, and when it was all over, I suggested that we should walk down this alley because I, T, knew a secret, and that if luck were on our side, we might see John passing through. Anyways, we get about 80 feet into the alley, and suddenly, a door to my left opens. There he was. It was him. John. My inner Nashvilleian roared with pride. I'd done it. The trick had worked, and I'd caught a celebrity in the Ryman Alley. I mustered every ounce of courage I could, and out of my mouth came a feeble, "Hey John," which he didn't even hear over a light breeze, and he walked right past me into Tootsie's. I asked my then girlfriend, "That was John Mulaney, right?" And she responded, "I think so." And yeah, that was that. It was a quiet drive home. Anyways, stories aside, it's not just local lore. Celebrities do indeed use this alley to get away from the crowds for a moment and sometimes to sneak into the nearby Tootsies. So if you're not afraid of a little stroll through a poorly lit alley, this could be your ticket to a quick hello from a celebrity. Tennessee, I hope I did our weird folklore justice. Having lived here for 22 years of my life, I thought I knew our weird stuff pretty well, but I even learned a thing or two from making this video. Now, if you want a part 2 for Tennessee, let me know below. Otherwise, if you liked this video, a subscription and a like are always appreciated. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers in 2025, so every sub counts, and who knows, maybe in a couple of years, you'll be able to say you were one of the OGs. Beyond this, I've got a couple of other Tennessee videos scripted, so I'd love to hear from y'all if you want to see more for your state. Anyways, with that, whether you were walking near Neyland Stadium and suddenly saw a cat walk by you on 2 legs, or if your neighbor opened up a strange haunted house attraction with a 40-page waiver to enter, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.